Daniel Hartley, 39 years old, stood beneath the gilded archway of the Verrazano Grand in Manhattan. Dressed in a charcoal suit grown thin at the elbows, his wife Sarah had stitched it for him 8 years ago, before she got sick. He tightened his hand around an embossed invitation. Vivian Ashford, 34th birthday celebration. The receptionist scanned it. The light blinked red. "Sir, your name isn't on tonight's list. Step aside, please." A woman in pearls glanced at his worn heels and whispered, "God, how embarrassing for him." A man in a tuxedo smirked as he passed. "Wrong hotel, buddy." The diner's 2 blocks down. A third woman lifted her phone, snapped a photo, and giggled. Daniel did not react. He bowed his head, folded the invitation, and turned to walk away. The revolving door spun open. A deep voice broke across the lobby. "Daniel? Daniel Hartley? My God, son." The entire lobby went still. Arthur Ashford, the 72-year-old founder of Ashford Industries, came striding across the marble floor with both hands trembling. He reached Daniel before Daniel could lift his head and pulled him into an embrace that was not the careful, social kind. It was the embrace of a man who had been waiting for someone to come back for 10 years. The lobby fell into the kind of silence that follows a dropped tray. Wesley Holloway, the event manager standing 2 paces from the front desk, turned the color of old paper. The receptionist who had turned Daniel away, a young woman named Adeline Brookhart, set her scanner down very slowly on the counter. A photographer hired for the evening lifted his camera by reflex, and the flash burst across the marble. Daniel did not move inside the embrace for a long moment. He smelled his old mentor's familiar aftershave, and he felt the suit shift across his shoulders, and somewhere beneath that, he felt the lining Sarah had once sewn into the breast pocket of this same suit 8 years ago. In the back bedroom of a rented house in Atlanta, the suit had been her wedding gift to him the year before she got sick. At the top of the grand staircase that swept down into the lobby, Vivian Ashford had been on her way to greet a final round of arriving guests. She stopped halfway down. She recognized Daniel at once. She had spoken to him only 2 hours earlier, in this very lobby, when he had been wearing a navy work jacket with the seal of the New York City Department of Health stitched on the shoulder. She had personally invited him to stay. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Adeline to Wesley, then settled, with a cold and precise stillness, on Wesley. She finished her descent without hurry. She crossed the marble until she stood beside her father, and she spoke loudly enough for every guest within 30 feet to hear her clearly. "Mr. Hartley, I personally invited you 2 hours ago, downstairs in this very lobby. I'd like to know why my staff just turned you away." Adeline began to stammer. "Miss Ashford, his name wasn't in the system. The late additions, my private invitations don't always sync with the front desk system," Vivienne said, still watching Wesley. "That is a process failure I'll address. Mr. Hartley, on behalf of this hotel and Ashford Industries, please accept my apology." Daniel did not raise his head all the way. He nodded once. Arthur turned to his daughter, his face carrying an expression Vivienne could not remember ever seeing on it before. "Vivienne, sweetheart, you invited him? You don't. You don't know who this man is, do you?" Vivienne frowned. She had never seen her father look at a stranger the way he was looking at Daniel now. Arthur drew Daniel and Vivienne into a private VIP room off the east wing of the ballroom and pulled the heavy door shut. Eleanor Ashford, his wife, slipped in behind them, her hand pressed to her collarbone. The door cut off the music and the laughter, and left them in a silence broken only by the distant clink of glasses on the other side of the wall. Arthur did not let go of Daniel's arm until they were standing in the center of the room. And even then he kept one hand on his shoulder, as if afraid that if he stepped back, Daniel might vanish again the way he had vanished 10 years ago, without saying goodbye. Arthur did not sit. He turned to his daughter and said, "Sweetheart, this man was a senior toxicologist at the Centers for Disease Control from 2008 to 2016. In April of 2016, 47 children at Lyndhurst Elementary in Ohio were poisoned with chlorpyrifos that had been added to their school milk by a kitchen worker who had been fired the week before. Daniel was the lead investigator on the federal response team. He was on a plane out of Atlanta inside of 40 minutes. He landed at the school in a National Guard helicopter. He identified the agent in 19 minutes. He wrote the on-site treatment protocol on the back of a cafeteria tray. Every one of those 47 children went home alive. None of them suffered permanent neurological damage. 3 of them are in college now. Arthur's voice broke, and he had to wait a moment before he could go on. Eleanor reached out and took his hand. One of those children was your cousin Theo's son. Your father's grandnephew. Theo was working in the Cleveland office that morning when the call came in. He didn't sleep for 3 days. The boy is 17 now, sweetheart. He's a senior at Shaker Heights High School. He's going to study toxicology at Johns Hopkins next fall. He doesn't know the name of the man who saved him. None of those families do. The records are sealed under federal non-disclosure. But I know. I've known for 10 years. I have carried it. Vivian sat down slowly on the edge of an upholstered chair. She knew the Lyndhurst story. Every member of the Ashford family knew it. She had heard her father tell it twice, both times after a glass of bourbon, both times with tears in his eyes, both times stopping at the same point in the story, just before he would have said the name of the investigator. She had assumed, for a decade, that he stopped because it hurt to remember. She understood now that he had stopped because he was forbidden to say the name aloud. She looked at Daniel. He was standing very still, the way a man stands when he has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has not yet been told he can put it down. "You're Dee Hartley," she said quietly. The lead author on the 2019 American Journal of Public Health paper. The protocol paper. "Yes," Daniel said. "That paper is required reading at Hopkins," she said. "I read it during my second year of medical school. I underlined the chapter on cross-reservoir distribution. I wrote a paper on it for my preventive medicine seminar. I cited you 41 times. He did not answer. He looked at the carpet between his shoes. Daniel finally spoke without raising his eyes. "After Lyndhurst, I had to interview every family for 8 months. Every parent. Every sibling. The kitchen worker's wife, who had not known. My wife Sarah was diagnosed with ALS that summer, the second week of June. The neurologist sat us down at Emory and gave us a window of 18 months to 4 years. I couldn't be in Atlanta on assignment and at her bedside at the same time. I couldn't keep flying. I left the agency in November. I signed the disclosure agreements. I moved her home to Queens to be near her family. She lived another 2 years and 10 months. She had good days. And she had days that weren't good. We had a daughter, Lily. She was born 7 months after Sarah's diagnosis. Sarah held her every day she could lift her arms. She lived long enough for Lily to know her face. She did not live long enough for Lily to remember it. Lily is 4 now. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth. A tear slid down her cheek and she did not lift her hand to catch it. Vivian did not move for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but only because she had spent a decade running a company and she knew how to keep it steady. "Mr. Hartley, I am very sorry about your wife, about what your country asked of you and then forgot to thank you for, about the fact that you came to my hotel tonight and were turned away at the door." Daniel finally looked up. He looked at her for the first time since the lobby. "Thank you, Miss Ashford." A knock came at the door. It was sharp, fast, and wrong for the rhythm of a birthday party. A young woman in a hotel uniform pushed it open without waiting. Her face was the color of paper. "Miss Ashford, we need a doctor." 2 guests just collapsed in the ballroom. Vivian stood up so quickly the chair behind her rocked. Daniel stood with her, by reflex, before he had decided to. They moved through the door together and ran down the corridor toward the ballroom. Halfway there, they passed 3 more guests bent double against the walls, retching onto the carpet. A waiter in a white jacket was already on his knees beside one of them, helpless, holding her shoulders. A man in a black jacket lay on the marble outside the ballroom doors, his arms and legs jerking in a tight, fast rhythm that no seizure Vivian had ever read about in a textbook quite matched. There was foam at the corner of his mouth. Daniel dropped to one knee beside him without slowing. He pulled back the man's eyelid and looked at the pupil for less than a second. He sniffed once near the man's mouth. the way a bartender sniffs a corked bottle. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck and counted the pulse against his own breath. He laid one palm flat against the man's chest and felt the ripple of involuntary muscle twitch running just under the skin, and his hand moved down to the abdomen and felt the same ripple in the muscle wall there too. He stood up. His face had changed. It was no longer the careful, contained face of the man who had been turned away at the door an hour earlier. It was the face of a man who had seen this exact thing once before. In a school gymnasium in Lyndhurst, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in April, and had hoped to his bones that he would never see it in another room again as long as he lived. "Miss Ashford," he said very quietly, "this is not food poisoning. This is sludge syndrome. Salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastrointestinal distress, emesis, pinpoint pupils, fasciculations across the chest and abdominal wall, bronchial secretions in the airway. This is organophosphate poisoning. A cholinesterase inhibitor, almost certainly chlorpyrifos, or something in the same chemical family." Vivienne looked into the ballroom. 500 guests in evening dress, talking and laughing, completely unaware. Champagne flutes on every table, a long marble bar along the north wall, where bartenders in white coats were still mixing drinks and shaking cocktails over fresh ice. She asked the only question that mattered. How was it delivered? Daniel looked at the flutes. He looked at the bar. He walked fast and straight across the lobby toward the bar and laid his hand on the side of the bar's primary ice well. The metal was cold. He looked at the chute where the ice came out into the bins. He bent and looked at the line that ran from the chute down to the central reservoir below. "Ice," he said. "Someone contaminated the ice machine. The agent gets distributed across every cold drink that comes off this bar. Anyone who has had a cold drink from this bar in the last 2 hours has been exposed. Spirits won't dilute it enough to matter. Anyone who has had a single cocktail with ice has been exposed." Vivienne turned and looked back at the ballroom. 500 glasses, 500 guests. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the bar and made them stop. Daniel turned to face her. For 1/2 second, something passed across his face that was not for the room or for the patients in the corridor. It was for himself. He had spent 10 years walking away from a job that asked him to make decisions that other people could not make. Because the last time he had made one of those decisions, his country had asked him to interview 47 families, and his wife had been diagnosed with a disease that had a 4-year ceiling, and he had had to choose. He had chosen to walk away. He had chosen Lily over the badge. And here, in the lobby of a hotel he had been turned away from 1 hour earlier, the badge had found him again. He could feel it settling back onto his shoulders, exactly as heavy as he remembered. He took one breath, closed his eyes for less than a second, and opened them. His voice dropped lower, but it did not waver. "Listen to me carefully. Organophosphate poisoning has a treatment window of approximately 45 minutes from the onset of symptoms before neurological damage becomes permanent. We have at most 600 milligrams of atropine in this hotel's emergency kit. That's enough for maybe 12 patients at proper initial dosing. New York Presbyterian is the closest hospital, 18 minutes by ambulance. Capacity for 60 critical patients at one time. We have potentially 500 exposed. The math is not on our side. I need you to do 4 things. In this order. In the next 90 seconds. Vivienne did not ask him if he was sure. She did not ask for a second opinion. She had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, and she had recognized sludge syndrome the moment he had named it. She had simply never seen it in a room. She nodded once. "Tell me. Lock the bar. No one drinks anything else. Now. Page every doctor, nurse, EMT, and physician's assistant in this room over the public address system. There are at least a dozen with active medical training on your guest list. I checked the program. Send them to me. Call New York City Poison Control. Give them my name and CDC identification number, SLT 2274. Tell them suspected mass chlorpyrifos exposure. 500 potentially affected. Request mutual aid from Bellevue, NYU Langone, Mount Sinai, and FDNY Hazmat. Now, Not in 5 minutes. And get me every bottle of atropine, pralidoxime, and diphenhydramine in this hotel's medical kit and from every pharmacy on this block. Send a runner. I'll write the doses. Vivienne did not nod. She had already begun. She lifted her phone, gave 3 voice commands in succession, and walked toward the bar, snapping her fingers at the head bartender to lock down the well. She had been a CEO for 3 years. She knew how to move 5 things at once. Daniel walked into the ballroom. He climbed onto a banquet chair in the center of the room and raised his voice to a pitch that he had not used in 10 years, the pitch of a federal field officer addressing a contaminated zone. My name is Daniel Hartley. I am a former toxicologist with the Centers for Disease Control. We have a chemical exposure incident in this room. Anyone who has had a cold beverage from this bar tonight, sit down where you are. Do not stand. Do not walk. Do not drink anything else. Anyone in this room with active medical training, come to me right now. The room obeyed. 500 people in the most expensive clothes they owned obeyed a man in a worn charcoal suit. Because the man in the worn charcoal suit had not raised his voice in panic. He had raised it in command. The next 34 minutes ran on a timer that only Daniel could hear. He divided the ballroom into 3 zones, marked off by tablecloths he tore from the banquet tables and laid down on the carpet to make visible borders. Red zone, against the north wall, for guests already in active crisis, 23 of them, the ones who had drunk steadily through the cocktail hour. Yellow zone, in the center. For guests with mild symptoms, 84 people, sweating and nauseated, but still upright. Green zone, against the south wall, for those exposed but asymptomatic, 393 guests, separated by the time at which they had taken their first cold drink, written on cocktail napkins pinned to their lapels with safety pins from the bridal kit at the hotel concierge desk. He gathered the medical professionals around him at the center of the red zone, 11 of them in evening clothes, 3 doctors, 4 nurses, 2 physician's assistants, and 2 paramedics, and he taught them in 90 seconds how to administer atropine for organophosphate poisoning, and how to titrate the dose to the disappearance of bronchial secretions, rather than to a fixed milligram weight. He showed them on the first patient himself, the man who had been seizing in the corridor, and he talked them through it as he worked, his voice low and even, the way a flight instructor talks a student down through bad weather. Then he stepped back and let them work. He did not have a current prescribing license. He knew the line, and he stood behind it. He wrote the doses on cocktail napkins, and the doctor signed them. The bartenders, who had been standing useless behind the lockdown well, were drafted as runners. The pastry chef, who had cried once into her hands when she understood what was happening and then washed her face in the prep sink, became Daniel's timekeeper. She held a stopwatch and called out intervals. Vivienne turned the VIP room into a command center. She kept 4 phone lines open at once. She convinced New York Presbyterian to call back its night staff, 2 surgical teams, and a full ER rotation by speaking directly to the chief medical officer at his home and offering to personally guarantee the cost of overtime out of the Ashford Foundation. She negotiated a transfer agreement with Bellevue, NYU Langone, and Mount Sinai over the course of 9 minutes, a process that ordinarily takes 3 to 4 business days. She got FDNY hazmat rolling out of 3 different stations. When the first wave of ambulances arrived, and there were only 12 of them in the first 15 minutes, she stepped out into the porte cochere, looked at the row of Rolls-Royces and Bentleys lined up at the valet stand, and made a decision that no event planner would ever have made. Every chauffeured car on this block is now a transport vehicle, she told the head of security. Stable patients only. 2 per car, with a medical attendant in each. The owners can sue me on Monday. Tonight I want their cars. She came back into the ballroom in time to see a woman in a green silk dress go into cardiac arrest in the red zone. Daniel was on the floor beside her, his weight balanced over locked elbows, doing chest compressions that had to be hard enough to break ribs to be effective at all. And he had no free hands. Vivienne dropped to her knees on the woman's other side without a word. She pressed 2 fingers to the carotid and counted aloud for him, the count even and unhurried, and after 30 seconds she rotated in for him, so he could call the next dose to the doctor working the patient beside them. They did not speak. They worked in absolute silence, hands brushing each other's wrists when they switched, and Vivienne had not done CPR on a living human being since her third-year clinical rotations at Hopkins 11 years earlier. But her hands remembered. The woman gasped. Her pulse came back, thready and irregular, but back. Daniel met Vivienne's eyes across the woman's chest. There was sweat dripping from his hairline onto the green silk. Neither of them said anything. They moved on to the next patient. By 9:31 in the evening, every red zone patient had been injected, stabilized, and either transported or staged for transport. Every yellow patient had been treated. Every green patient had been decontaminated and was being monitored on a list that the head of housekeeping was keeping by hand on a clipboard. The last ambulance pulled away from the porte cochere with its lights spinning across the gold archway, and the only sound in the ballroom was the soft hiss of an ice machine still running somewhere behind the lockdown bar, and the breathing of the few staff members who had not yet allowed themselves to sit down. Daniel stood in the middle of the ruined ballroom. His shirt was soaked through. His suit jacket was draped over the back of a chair across the room, and he had forgotten about it. A woman in a federal jacket walked across the carpet toward him. Badge on her hip. Dr. Hartley. Special Agent Reyna Ortiz, FBI. We pulled the maintenance logs on the ice machine. The contaminant was added to the central reservoir between 4:15 and 4:30 this afternoon. We have a problem. Daniel did not move. At 4:15 this afternoon, he had been on the rooftop of this hotel with a sample kit, taking water from the cooling tower for his routine Legionella inspection. In the security office on the second floor, Agent Ortiz played back the footage. A man in a maintenance uniform, mid-40s, average build, entered the basement service corridor at 4:18 in the afternoon, carrying a small toolbox and a clipboard. He used a forged credential from a legitimate supply company that held a contract with the hotel for ice machine servicing on the second Wednesday of every month. He went into the ice machine room. He stayed inside for 14 minutes. He emerged at 4:34, walked back the way he had come, and exited the hotel through the loading dock. He did not hurry. He did not look back. The cameras caught his face only twice, both times in the brief seconds when he passed under a fluorescent panel. What was harder for Daniel to look at was the second screen, which Ortiz pulled up next to the footage. The chemical, the dose, the dispersal mechanism through the central ice reservoir, the deliberate use of a venue's beverage cycle to scale exposure across a closed population, the specific timing window for maximum cross-contamination before service began. All of it was lifted, almost line for line, from a paper Daniel himself had written and published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2019, 3 years after Lyndhurst, when portions of the federal report had been declassified and released for academic study. He had written that paper to teach hospital toxicology departments how to recognize and respond to mass exposure events. He had written it in the third week after Sarah's funeral. He had written it so that other people would live. He sat down in the security office chair very slowly. Vivienne sat down in the chair next to him. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her mascara was smudged at the inner corners of her eyes. She was still in her birthday dress, with someone else's blood on the hem, and a small tear at her shoulder, where she had caught it on the corner of a banquet table while she had been kneeling. "My report," Daniel said. He spoke so quietly Ortiz had to lean in. "He used my report. I wrote it so hospitals could recognize this and save people. He read it to learn how to do it. The cross-reservoir distribution model is in Chapter 3. He used my Chapter 3. Vivienne reached across the small space between their chairs and laid her hand over his on the arm of the chair. It was the first time in the entire night that the two of them had touched each other deliberately. "Daniel," she said, "look at me." He turned his head. He looked at her. 47 children in Ohio went home that day because of you. 500 adults in this hotel are going home tonight because of you. Whoever read your paper learned how to kill. You taught the world how to save. That is not the same thing. Do not let him take that from you. Do not let him have that. On top of everything else he has already taken. He did not move his hand from under hers. He did not speak. After a moment, he closed his eyes, and she felt him breathe in once, slowly, all the way down to the bottom of his chest, The way a man breathes when he has been holding something underwater and has just remembered that he is allowed to come up. At 9:58, Agent Ortiz returned with the identification. The man on the footage was Marcus Vale, 48 years old, formerly the plant manager of an agricultural chemical facility called AgriPure outside Terre Haute, Indiana. AgriPure had filed for bankruptcy in 2023 after the FDA banned chlorpyrifos for food crop use, a regulation that had been pushed through the Senate by a single sponsoring senator, Caleb Whitfield. Whitfield was a guest in the ballroom that night. He had survived the evening because he drank bourbon on the rocks and had not yet finished his second glass when Daniel locked down the bar. Marcus Vale had lost his job, his house, and his marriage in 18 months. The plant had been the largest single employer in the county. 6 months after the divorce, his 19-year-old son, Ethan Vale, had taken his own life in the family's empty garage in Terre Haute on a Tuesday in February, 2 days after his community college had withdrawn his financial aid because his father had stopped being able to file the parental forms. "We have him in custody," Ortiz said. "Picked him up at a roadside motel in Queens 20 minutes ago. He hadn't run. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with the television on, waiting to confirm Whitfield's death on the 11 o'clock news. Dr. Hartley, he asked to speak with you, by name. He was very specific about it. He said he would say nothing to a federal interviewer until he had said one thing to you first." At 11:20 in the evening, Daniel sat across a metal table from Marcus Vale in a federal interview room at 26 Federal Plaza. Vivienne watched through the one-way glass with Agent Ortiz, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Marcus Vale looked, on first glance, nothing like a man who had just tried to kill 500 people. He looked like a tired, middle-aged man in a Carhartt jacket whose hands trembled when he set them on the table. He met Daniel's eyes. "Dr. Hartley," he said, "I read your paper 3 years ago when I was looking for a way out. Not for me, for what they did to my boy. I want you to know 2 things. First, I am not sorry about Whitfield. Second, I am sorry about everyone else. I tried to use a dose that would only hit the heavy drinkers. Whitfield drinks bourbon on the rocks at every event. 3 glasses, minimum, every time he speaks. I did the math. I did not think it would scale to 500. Daniel did not answer for a long time. Vivienne, behind the glass, watched his shoulders. They did not move. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Mr. Vale, the math you didn't do is the cross-contamination math. Ice cubes from a central reservoir get distributed across every cold drink, not just the bourbons. That's chapter 4 of the paper you read." Marcus nodded slowly. "I should have read further. You should have called me," Daniel said. "I would have answered the phone." Marcus Vale closed his eyes, and his shoulders began to shake without sound. Daniel stood up. He walked to the door. He paused there, his hand on the frame, and he turned back. "Mr. Vale, I am sorry about your son." He left the room. In the corridor, Vivienne was waiting for him. She did not say anything. She held out his suit jacket, which she had carried with her from the hotel without his noticing, and she helped him into it the way someone helps a man who has been awake for too long. They rode the elevator down to the street in silence. At 12:15 in the morning, Vivienne drove Daniel home to Astoria herself. No driver, no security detail. Just a Mercedes sedan she had pulled from the Ashford Fleet garage on 48th Street, and her own 2 hands on the wheel. The streets of Manhattan were almost empty at that hour. The city was still very bright. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the tires on the bridge filled the car. "My daughter is asleep," Daniel said eventually. He was looking out his window. "My neighbor is staying overnight. Her name is Marin Castellane. She was the one who made me come tonight, you know. I had taken the suit out of the closet and put it back twice. She told me Sarah had sewn it for me 8 years ago, and that it had been hanging in my closet long enough. She told me her husband had been a Brooklyn cop for 31 years, and that he had slept well every night because he stood on the right side of things, and that I owed it to my daughter to do the same. She made me come." Vivienne did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was low. "My cousin Theo named his son after my father, Arthur Theodore. He's going to study toxicology at Johns Hopkins next fall. He doesn't know your name. The family kept it from him because of the disclosure agreements. I'm going to tell him tomorrow, with his father's permission. I think he's been waiting to thank you for 10 years and didn't know there was a name to put on the gratitude. Daniel looked at her then. Not for long, just once. Manhattan was bright in the windshield. When she stopped the car in front of his building in Astoria, he opened the door and paused with one foot on the curb. Miss Ashford, Vivienne, she said quietly. We pushed atropine into the same patient at the same time tonight. I think we can drop the formality. He smiled then for the first time all evening. It was a small smile, and it surprised him as much as it surprised her. Vivienne, thank you for believing me when I said it was organophosphate. Most chief executives would have asked for a second opinion. I have an MD from Hopkins, she said. I recognize sludge syndrome too. I just needed someone in the room who'd seen it before. Good night, Daniel. He stepped out of the car and walked up the steps of his building. She did not pull away from the curb. She sat there for almost 3 minutes with the engine running, watching the second-floor window light up as Miss Castellane heard him come in, and she realized, with a small and surprising clarity, that she did not want to drive home to her own apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in late October, Daniel stood at his kitchen counter in Astoria, pouring batter into a cast-iron pan in the shape of a 5-pointed star. The mold had been Sarah's. There was a knock at the door. He set down the ladle, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and went to answer it. Vivienne stood on the landing in a soft cream sweater and dark jeans, holding a brown paper carton of strawberries from the farmer's market on Steinway Street. She wore no makeup. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Tucked under her arm was a folded copy of the Sunday New York Times. The front page above the fold carried a photograph of the lobby of the Verrazano Grand, and the headline, "The Quiet Toxicologist Who Saved 500 Lives at the Verrazano." Daniel had not seen the article yet. He had been making pancakes. Lily Hartley appeared at her father's hip before he could speak. She had her mother's wide, serious eyes and a tangle of yellow curls and a smear of pancake batter on her chin. She looked up at the woman on the landing and her face brightened with recognition. "Daddy, it's the lady from the news." Vivienne crouched down on the welcome mat until she was at Lily's eye level. "Hi, Lily. I'm Vivienne. Your daddy and I worked together a few weeks ago. He told me you make the best pancake stars in Queens." Lily considered this with great seriousness. "He's wrong. I make the best in all of New York." Vivienne laughed. A real, surprised laugh that came up out of her chest. Daniel stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in, please. The first batch is almost ready." They ate breakfast around the small kitchen table. Daniel made fresh coffee. Lily insisted on cutting Vivienne's strawberries herself. Daniel told Vivienne about Sarah, not about her illness, but about the way she had laughed with her whole body, and the way she had named Lily after the lilies that grew in her mother's garden in Vermont. Vivienne listened. She did not try to fill the silences. When breakfast was almost finished, Lily slid a star-shaped pancake onto the edge of Vivienne's plate. "Mommy used to say stars are for wishes, so you have to make a wish." Vivienne looked up. Her eyes were wet. She did not say her wish out loud, but she looked across the table at Daniel as she took the first bite. And Daniel looked back. And Lily, who at 4 was already a quiet observer of the unspoken language between adults, busied herself with the strawberries and pretended very hard not to notice. After Lily had run off to her bedroom to draw, Vivienne reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table. "My family's foundation announced a new endowed chair at Johns Hopkins yesterday afternoon," she said. "The Sarah Hartley Chair in Pediatric Toxicology. Funded for 50 years. I wanted you to know before the press release goes out tomorrow morning. I wanted Lily to know, when she's old enough, that her mother's name is going to be on a door at one of the best medical schools in the world, where doctors are taught how to save children." Daniel opened the envelope. His hands were not steady. Inside was the formal announcement on heavy cream stock, and beneath it, a smaller card in Vivienne's own handwriting that read simply, "For Sarah, with gratitude that cannot be measured." He did not say anything for a long time. He set the cards down on the table very carefully, and he reached across the strawberry bowl and took her hand. A month after that, Daniel signed a contract with the Ashford Foundation to serve as the Chief Scientific Officer of the new Pediatric Toxicology Initiative, working out of an office on the 58th floor of the Ashford Tower. The position had been created for him. The salary was generous. He took the offer for one reason that had nothing to do with the salary and everything to do with the clause Vivienne had personally added to the contract on the last page. Mr. Hartley reserves the absolute right to leave the office by 4:30 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, to collect his daughter from preschool. No exceptions, including foundation emergencies. Marcus Vail received a 30-year federal sentence. He pleaded guilty and waived his right to appeal. Senator Caleb Whitfield, after spending 2 days at New York Presbyterian and another 5 at home, came out publicly in support of a national ban on chlorpyrifos for all uses, and the bill passed both chambers within 6 weeks. They named it the Lyndhurst-Verrazano Act. Daniel was invited to speak at the Capitol Hill signing ceremony. He declined, politely, and sent a written statement instead. Wesley Holloway was released from his contract with the Verrazano Grand the morning after the incident, and from the parent hotel group 2 weeks later, after an internal review, found that he had received the late ad notification on his pager and had chosen not to forward it for verification. Eleanor Ashford wrote Daniel a letter by hand, 3 pages long, about Theo's son and about Sarah and about second chances. Daniel kept it in the top drawer of his new desk. On a Sunday in late autumn, Daniel and Lily took the subway into Manhattan and rode the elevator up to Vivienne's penthouse in Tribeca. Lily insisted on purple napkins. Vivienne had bought purple napkins. The 3 of them stood around the kitchen island making pasta carbonara from scratch. Lily stood on a step stool and stirred the sauce. Vivienne diced pancetta. Daniel poured 2 glasses of red wine and 1 glass of apple juice. In the middle of stirring, Lily looked up at Vivienne and asked, with the matter-of-fact gravity that only a 4-year-old can produce, "Vivienne, are you going to be my second mommy?" The kitchen went still. Vivienne looked at Daniel. Daniel did not look away. Vivienne crouched down on her heels until she was at Lily's level on the step stool. "I don't think anyone can ever replace your mommy, Lily. But if you'd like, I can be Vivienne, your friend, who loves your daddy, and who loves you very much." Lily considered this for a long moment, the way she considered all important things. Then she nodded, with great seriousness. "Okay, but you still have to learn to make better pancakes." Vivienne laughed, and Daniel laughed, and Lily laughed, because the grown-ups were laughing. After dinner, after Lily had been read 3 chapters of her favorite picture book, and had fallen asleep on the long couch by the window with her cheek against a velvet cushion, Daniel and Vivienne stood out on the terrace with the Hudson River spread silver below them. "Theo wrote me yesterday," Vivienne said. "Theo's son, I mean. Arthur Theodore. He wants to meet you. He said he's been waiting his whole life to thank the man who saved him. He doesn't know yet that the man is going to be in his life every Sunday." Daniel turned his head to look at her. "Is he? Going to be in your life every Sunday?" Vivienne smiled. The river was very bright behind her. "That's what I'm asking." They did not kiss that night. They stood side by side on the terrace, with the cold autumn air on their faces, and their hands almost, but not quite touching on the railing. And they watched the lights of Manhattan come on across the water. It was a beginning, slow and quiet and entirely real, and it was worth what it had cost to arrive at it.